All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're talking about a massive shift in U.S. trade policy that's already hitting the price of, well, just about everything. It's being called the 2025 tariff shockwave, and we're going to break down exactly what it means for the world, and more importantly, for your wallet.
To really get our heads around this, let's just start with a simple question. Picture this. What if almost everything you buy that comes from another country suddenly got more expensive? Not just a little bit, but noticeably so. What would that actually do to your budget?
Well, the answer, at a minimum, is 10%. And look, this is not a what-if scenario. This is the new reality. A baseline 10% tariff is now being slapped on nearly all U.S. imports. That's a policy shift so big, we really haven't seen anything like it in over 100 years.
So how on earth did we get here? In this first part, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of this new tariff wall. We'll look at the legal power behind it, the incredible financial impact it's having, and the other key changes that are completely rewriting the rules of American trade. Okay, so the whole legal basis for this thing rests on something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA for short. Now, this act gives the president some pretty broad powers to regulate business during a national emergency, but using it to roll out such massive across-the-board tariffs, that is extremely controversial. And as you're about to see, it's at the very center of a huge legal fight. To really grasp the scale of this, let's just follow the money for a second. Before all this kicked off, the U.S. government was collecting less than $10 billion a month from tariffs. You know, that was the normal, the baseline we'd seen for years. And now, we're seeing monthly collections that are blowing past $30 billion. That's more than a threefold jump every single month. We're not talking about a small tweak here. This is like turning on a fire hose of new revenue for the government. And if you zoom out to the whole year, here's what it looks like. For the 2025 fiscal year, the total amount of money collected from these duties hit a mind-boggling $215.2 billion. That's the absolutely staggering amount this policy pulled in during its very first year. But hang on, that 10% is really just the beginning. On top of that, we've got a whole bunch of other major changes. There are these targeted 50% reciprocal tariffs hitting certain countries. The administration has also shut down that tax-free lane for small online packages, the rule that lets stuff under $800 come in duty-free. Plus, key materials like steel and aluminum are getting hit with 50% duties, and most imported cars are facing a 25% tariff. So, as you can imagine, a move this big doesn't just happen without making some waves. The reaction from the rest of the world has been fast and furious, leading to some serious disruptions and really ratcheting up trade tensions with some of our biggest partners. I mean, just take a look at the effect on India. This number, negative 28.5%, represents the drop in their exports to the United States in just 5 months. It's a perfect example of just how quick and how severe the impact has been on some countries. And really, these hotspots are popping up all over the globe. India's huge textile and jewelry industries have been hit really hard. Negotiations with China are incredibly tense, with tariffs constantly shifting. Even our closest neighbor, Canada, is staring down the barrel of new duties. And now, there's even talk about hitting Indian rice with tariffs, which could spark a whole new fire. And of course, these shockwaves that start overseas, they always find their way back home, right into the domestic economy. So, in this section, let's focus on what this all means for the price you pay, looking at two really critical areas: cars and medicine. Does this number look painfully familiar? It probably should if you've tried to buy a car lately. That's the new average monthly car payment in the US. And yeah, a big chunk of that increase is because of this new tariff policy. So here's how it breaks down. The auto industry basically got hit with a double whammy. First, you've got tariffs on the raw materials, the steel and aluminum, which drives up the cost to build any car. Then, on top of that, there's a 25% tariff on most imported cars and parts. Automakers like GM and Ford started reporting billions in new costs, and after a while, they just couldn't absorb it anymore. So where does that cost go? It gets passed on to you, leading to an average price hike of almost $2,000 on new models. Okay, let's switch gears to something even more essential: pharmaceuticals. This number, $51 billion, is what experts estimate could be the annual increase in what Americans pay for drugs if a 25% tariff was fully passed on to all of us. And this is where things get really fragile. The U.S. is incredibly dependent on imported drug ingredients, especially from India and China.
I mean, get this, up to 95% of the generic drugs used in our hospitals rely on materials from those two countries. And because generic drugs run on such razor-thin profit margins, the companies that make them can't just eat these new costs. That creates a very real risk that they'll just stop making some of them, which could lead to critical medicine shortages.
Now, one of the stated goals of this whole policy is to bring manufacturing back home to the US. But this right here is a huge reality check. You can't just snap your fingers and build a new pharmaceutical factory. It's a highly regulated, complicated process that takes 5 to 10 years. So in the short term, the reality is less about new American factories and a lot more about higher costs and a riskier supply chain.
This all brings us to a really pivotal chapter in this story. You see, this entire tariff system we've been talking about, it's not exactly built on solid rock. In fact, it's facing a massive legal challenge that has gone all the way to the Supreme Court.
The whole legal fight really boils down to this one core conflict. On one side, you have the administration arguing that the IEEPA gives the president sweeping power to do this. But on the other side, lower courts have already ruled that using the act this way goes way beyond the power that Congress actually granted. It is a classic, high-stakes showdown over the limits of presidential power.
And believe me, the stakes are absolutely massive. This chart shows that the tariffs being challenged in court, the ones based on that IEEPA law, account for a whopping 61% of all this new revenue. If the Supreme Court rules against the administration, the majority of this entire revenue stream could literally vanish overnight.
So for our last section, let's zoom all the way out. Beyond the court cases and the immediate price hikes, there's a really fierce, fundamental debate going on about the long-term vision here. Is this policy actually building a stronger country, or is it just a very, very costly experiment?
And here it is, probably the boldest claim made in favor of this new tariff strategy. President Trump has suggested that this flood of new tariff money could eventually grow large enough to replace or maybe even get rid of the federal income tax. That is a truly dramatic vision for the future. But it's really important to add some context here. This chart puts the two revenue sources side by side. That really tall bar, that's the money from individual income taxes, which is by far the biggest source of funding for the federal government. And that much smaller bar is the new record-setting tariff revenue. So as you can see, while it's a huge number, it's still just a fraction of what the income tax brings in. And that leaves us right here, with the biggest question of all. This policy has, without a doubt, shaken up global trade and poured money into government coffers. But it's also raised prices for all of us and created a lot of friction around the world. So, with a landmark Supreme Court decision just around the corner, the question we're all left with is this. Are these tariffs building a stronger, more independent American economy? Or are we all just paying to live in a more expensive one?